February 1st, 1979. 5 million people crowded the streets of Tehran. They climbed trees and stood on rooftops to see the Boeing 747 touch the tarmac. Ruhollah Khomeini stepped out of the plane. The crowd roared. They expected the end of corruption. They expected the end of the Shah's secret police. They expected a new era of freedom. Why did the celebration turn into a purge? The promise was simple, but the reality was a transformation of the entire state. The footage shows Khomeini sits cross-legged on a simple rug. He speaks softly. He promises that no one will be persecuted. But while he spoke, his supporters were already marking doors with red paint. Paramilitary groups moved through the neighborhoods. They didn't just talk about change. They seized television stations, occupied police precincts, and broke into the offices of the old regime. Hope was the first casualty. In the frame, gallows erected in public squares. Faith was no longer a personal choice. It became a legal requirement. The new authorities drafted lists of enemies. Former ministers, generals, and even students were dragged from their homes at night. The sound of heavy boots on stairs became the new rhythm of life in the city. There was no turning back. At first glance, a liberation from tyranny, but in reality, the birth of a more absolute control. The new government didn't just replace the old laws, they replaced the people who enforced them with those who obeyed without question. It wasn't just a political shift, it was a total restructuring of Iranian society. The cameras recorded the results. Piles of banned books burned in the streets. The transition from monarchy to theocracy was signed in blood. The archives remained closed for decades. September 24, 1902. Ruhollah was born in Khomeini. This was a poor conservative town in central Iran. At this time, the Qajar dynasty held the throne, but the monarchy was weak. The central government had lost control over the provinces. Local landowners, tribal leaders, and private militias acted as the true authorities. They collected taxes and enforced their own rules. Law was uneven. Justice depended entirely on raw power. Violence was a daily occurrence. His father was Syed Mustafa Khomeini. He was a local cleric and a prominent religious figure. Mustafa did not stay silent. He challenged the powerful landowners and protested against the mistreatment of villagers. These actions created enemies. In early 1903, the situation turned lethal. Ruhollah was only 5 months old. Mustafa was traveling on the road near Khomeini when gunmen stepped out from the brush. They opened fire. Mustafa was shot dead on the spot. The attackers were not common thieves. Investigations later linked them to local elites who felt threatened by Mustafa's influence. The killers were never punished. The court system remained silent. This event proved a hard fact to the family. Power protected its own, and justice was selective. The Khomeini household changed. The rooms were filled with the smell of incense and the sound of mourning. Ruhollah was raised by 2 women, his mother, Hajar, and his aunt, Sahiba. They did not let him forget. They constantly repeated the details of the ambush. They spoke of Mustafa as a martyr. In their stories, he was a hero who died standing up for the oppressed. The footage of the era shows a landscape of dust and ruin. Ruhollah learned a specific lesson. Death was not just something to fear. If a man died for a cause, death became meaningful. It became a weapon. This was his first introduction to the concept of martyrdom. Life in Khomeini remained brutal. Iran suffered through repeated famines and outbreaks of disease. Foreign powers like Britain and Russia carved the country into spheres of influence. Internal chaos followed. In rural towns, hunger was a constant companion. Education was limited to religious texts. Survival came before comfort. Ruhollah watched as neighbors died from simple infections or lack of bread. He saw how little protection the state offered to ordinary people. By the time he reached adulthood, the world had already hardened him. He had seen the result of weakness. He decided he would never be weak. Thus began his journey toward power. 1917. The cycle of death continued. His aunt, Sahiba, passed away. 1 year later, in 1918, his mother, Hajar, died. At 16 years old, Ruhollah had no immediate family left. They were all gone. He moved into the homes of distant relatives, but the damage was done. The footage of his life at this stage would show a silent, isolated teenager. Death and loss were no longer events. They were a permanent environment. He did not react with tears. He reacted with observation. He watched how grief functioned. He saw that suffering could be converted into a different kind of currency. In his mind, those who endured the most pain earned the right to command others. How did this shape his future? It removed the fear of violence. He stopped seeing conflict as a tragedy to be avoided. Instead, he saw it as a surgical tool. It was a way to mold history and liquidate enemies. He did not seek peace. He sought a way to harness the chaos. His education began in local religious schools. Later, he moved to larger centers. The visual is clear. Rows of students sitting on stone floors, reciting ancient texts for hours. Religion provided what his childhood lacked. It provided structure. It provided absolute certainty. There was also the element of control. In rural areas, the central government was invisible. The police were nowhere to be found. But the clerics were everywhere. People bowed. People obeyed. Ruhollah watched this dynamic closely. He realized that religious authority did not need a ballot box. It did not need written laws. It functioned on raw, unquestioned loyalty. At first glance, Iran was a sovereign nation, but in reality, it was a shell. By the early 1920s, the country was decomposing. Corruption destroyed the economy. Foreign powers moved in to seize oil and trade routes. The government in Tehran could not protect its own borders. The clerics had an explanation for the collapse. They blamed secularism. They blamed foreign interference. Ruhollah did not just listen to these lectures, he internalized them. To him, the poverty and chaos were not political failures, they were divine punishments. He believed Iran was suffering because it had abandoned strict religious law. In the early 1920s, he packed his few belongings. He headed toward Qom. This was the heart of religious education. It was a city of stone, heat, and absolute dogma. Events accelerated. He was no longer a student, he was becoming a weapon. The journey to the center of power had begun. 1921. Ruhollah Khomeini arrived in Qom. The city was not a simple destination for pilgrims. It functioned as a factory for religious authority. Clerics there did not just study. They prepared to govern entire populations across the Middle East. By entering these gates, Khomeini chose a specific trajectory. This was not a pursuit of quiet scholarship. It was a calculated move toward political power. He mastered Islamic law, Arabic grammar, and theology. He studied under the most senior clerics in the country. His routine was absolute. He woke early and followed a rigid schedule. He avoided socializing. He never used humor. Witnesses from that time describe a man of extreme discipline. His entire existence centered on three concepts: strict belief, strict rules, and strict obedience. By the 1930s, the student became the master. Khomeini began training his own followers. On the surface, he remained calm and professional. He spoke in a low, serious voice, but his private notes revealed radical positions. He viewed secular governments as inherently illegal. In his view, a king or a president had no right to exist. He rejected the concept of popular sovereignty. To Khomeini, elections were a threat to order. He viewed parliaments as weak and indecisive institutions. He argued that laws written by men were worthless compared to laws enforced by clerics. He wanted religious scholars to manage every aspect of life. This included the legal system, the economy, and private behavior inside the home. At first glance, a quiet teacher, but in reality, a revolutionary architect. Events accelerated in the 1940s. Khomeini began printing and distributing illegal texts. These documents attacked the modern legal system. He did not hide his support for corporal punishment. He wrote that beatings and amputations were necessary tools for social control. He believed fear was a valid instrument of the state. There was no turning back. By the early 1960s, the landscape of Iran shifted. The old world collided with the new. Mohammad Reza Shah launched a massive modernization program. The Shah wanted to transform Iran into a Western-style power to prevent a communist uprising. He seized land from the church and gave women the right to vote. The monarch believed he was securing his throne. January 1963. The tension reached a breaking point. January 1963. The Shah launched the White Revolution. This was not a military campaign, but a massive government-led reform program designed to dismantle the old Iranian social structure. The plan moved fast. The government seized large land estates from wealthy owners and redistributed small plots to peasants. They expanded public education into rural areas. They granted women the right to vote and the right to run for political office. Finally, they stripped religious courts of their legal authority. On paper, the goal was clear. The Shah wanted to eliminate poverty and pull Iran into the modern Western world. But for the religious elite, the reforms were a catastrophe. The clerics felt the blow immediately. They lost their land, their steady income, and their control over the law. Ruhollah Khomeini reacted with more intensity than his peers. He did not view these policies as simple political choices. He saw them as a calculated assault on Islam. Khomeini publicly accused the Shah of corrupting the youth, destroying religion, and acting as a puppet for foreign powers. He specifically targeted women's suffrage. He claimed that allowing women to vote would collapse the moral order of the nation. The rhetoric escalated. His sermons became louder and more frequent. In June 1963, during the holy month of Muharram, Khomeini stepped onto the pulpit. He did not use metaphors. He openly challenged the Shah's right to rule. The message spread with lightning speed. Audio tapes and handwritten notes moved through a vast network of mosques. The result was chaos. Protests erupted in Tehran and Qom. Thousands of men filled the squares. The footage from the time shows the scale of the anger. The government did not negotiate. They sent in tanks, infantry, and police units with live ammunition. The sound of heavy gunfire lasted for days. The streets became a combat zone. In the end, hundreds of protesters lay dead on the pavement. Some unofficial reports claimed the death toll reached into the thousands, but the regime suppressed the data. The exact number of casualties remained a state secret. The response was surgical. Shortly after the street battles ended, security forces moved in. They arrested Ruhollah Khomeini in the middle of the night. He was taken to a cell and interrogated. The Shah believed that by removing the leader, he could kill the movement. Events accelerated. There was no turning back. Why did the arrest fail to silence him? The Shah expected the cleric to fade into obscurity. Instead, the cell door became a megaphone. The footage from 1963 shows the result. Protests erupted in the streets of Tehran. This was no longer a local dispute. Ruhollah became a living symbol of resistance. Iranians who previously ignored his sermons now saw him as a martyr. He was a religious figure willing to challenge the state and accept the consequences. The government relented after several months. Ruhollah was released from custody. He did not step back. He did not lower his voice. He became more aggressive. 1964. The Shah's government passed a new law. It granted legal immunity to American military advisors and their families. Under these rules, Americans could not be tried in Iranian courts for any crime. The sound of public outrage grew. Ruhollah attacked the law immediately. He called it a national humiliation. To him, this was proof that Iran had surrendered its independence to Washington. He framed the issue around dignity and sovereignty. This message resonated. It reached beyond religious circles and touched secular nationalists. At first glance, a legal technicality, but in reality, a spark for revolution. The Shah changed his strategy. Arrest was no longer enough. He viewed Ruhollah as a contagion that had to be removed from the body of the country. November 1964. Security forces moved in without warning. They did not take him to a cell. They took him to the airport. Ruhollah was forced onto a plane and expelled from Iran. His first stop was Turkey. The exile backfired. The government allowed him to relocate to Najaf, Iraq. This was a mistake. Najaf housed the most prestigious religious schools in the Shiite world. Here, Ruhollah had time. He had distance. Most importantly, he had a global platform. He was no longer just reacting to the Shah's decrees. He was building a vision. From his small house in Iraq, he reached students from across the Middle East. He began constructing a rigid political system. During these years, Ruhollah finalized his most extreme concept. He called it the Guardianship of the Jurist. The idea was simple. A single religious leader should rule the entire nation. This ruler would hold absolute power. He would command the military. He would appoint the judges. He would dictate the laws. There would be no separation of powers and no legitimate opposition. The public would simply obey. Events accelerated. The foundation for a new kind of state was now complete. He waited for the right moment to return. The era of the Shah was ending. Elections were a trap. Ruhollah taught that voting created only chaos and weakness. He believed dissent was the root of corruption. He argued that mercy toward enemies was a strategic failure. In his view, a spared enemy only returned stronger. His system functioned on two pillars: punishment without appeal and execution without apology. How did these ideas spread? The Shah controlled the airwaves and the press, but Ruhollah used cassette tapes. It was a cheap and effective technology for the 1970s. Supporters hid the tapes in suitcases and packages. They smuggled them across the border into Iran. The footage from the era shows the process. People gathered in small rooms. They played the tapes at low volume in homes, shops, and mosques. The message reached students, factory workers, and religious families. These groups already viewed the Shah with suspicion. The promise was clear and direct. Overthrow the Shah, restore the faith, make Iran independent again. But there was a hidden price. Ruhollah did not intend to debate his rivals. He intended to remove them. This included secular thinkers, leftist groups, and even clerics who disagreed with his vision. He labeled them all enemies of religion. The Shah watched, but he did not see the danger. For years, the monarchy underestimated the movement. Meanwhile, the economy began to fail. Inflation climbed. Unemployment rose. Anger over corruption became a constant presence in the streets. The secret police, the Savak, responded with force. They arrested dissidents. They killed opponents in the streets and in prison cells. But the repression backfired. Every dead protester served as proof for Ruhollah's message. The camera records the aftermath. Black-clad crowds mourning their dead. By the late 1970s, the situation shifted. Demonstrations spread to every major city. Millions of people marched. The Shah's soldiers opened fire with automatic weapons. The cycle was locked. Blood fed outrage, and outrage fed the rebellion. There was no turning back. 1978, Iran expelled Ruhollah Khomeini. He did not disappear. He moved to France and settled in a small village near Paris. This was a strategic mistake for the Shah. In France, Khomeini had access to international media and modern telephone lines. His voice reached farther than ever before. February 1, 1979. After 15 years in exile, his plane landed in Tehran. The Shah was gone. He had fled the country 2 weeks earlier, leaving behind a power vacuum and a broken government. How did the public react? The footage shows the scale. Millions of people filled the streets from the airport to the city center. It was the largest public gathering in the history of the nation. People climbed onto rooftops. They stood on the roofs of cars and packed the highways. They wanted a glimpse of the man in the black turban. Many believed he had come to end the tyranny. They expected justice after decades of repression. But the country was already collapsing. The army was divided into factions. Police stations stood abandoned. Government offices stopped functioning. In this chaos, Khomeini presented himself as a calm and moral authority. He moved quickly. He rejected the remaining royal government and declared it illegal. Within days, he appointed his own interim leaders. He bypassed every formal legal process. Power shifted overnight. It did not happen through law. It happened through absolute loyalty. The legal system was the first to fall. Existing courts were shut down or simply ignored. In their place, revolutionary courts appeared almost immediately. These new courts operated without written rules. Who were the judges? Often, they were clerics or loyal followers. Most had zero legal training. Trials were held behind closed doors. Defense lawyers were not allowed. Accusations alone were enough to decide a person's fate. The verdict was usually final. At first glance, a liberation, but in reality, a purge. Armed revolutionary groups spread through the cities. They set up checkpoints at every major intersection. They searched private homes and arrested anyone linked to the old system. The targets were specific: military officers, intelligence workers, ministers, and judges. They were dragged from their houses. Many were taken in the middle of the night. The sound of heavy boots on stairs became a signal of death. No one was safe in their beds. The revolution had begun. January 1979. The purge began. Families received no news of their missing relatives. Within weeks, the first executions were carried out. The legal process was non-existent. Some prisoners were brought into the courtroom, tried, and killed on the same day. There was no defense. There were no lawyers. The trials lasted minutes. Guards extracted confessions through physical force. Judges ignored evidence entirely. There was no mechanism for appeals. By March 1979, the death toll reached hundreds. Executions spread to every province. The methods were brutal. Firing squads operated in prison courtyards. Gallowses were erected for public hangings. The state took the bodies. They were buried in unmarked graves in the desert. The government issued warnings to the grieving families. No funerals, no public mourning, no gravestones. Once the old regime was destroyed, Ruhollah moved to secure total control. He began a systematic removal of his former allies. This was a calculated betrayal. Leftist groups, nationalists, and liberal activists had been the backbone of the revolution. They had fought the Shah in the streets for months. These groups expected a seat at the table. They believed a new democracy was coming. They were wrong. One by one, Ruhollah labeled these organizations as threats to the state. The attacks were physical. Pro-government mobs stormed political offices. They smashed equipment and burned files. Leaders were pulled from their homes at night. Some faced the firing squads immediately. Others managed to cross the border into exile. The media was the next target. The footage shows empty newsrooms. Independent newspapers were shuttered by decree. Security forces detained journalists on the streets. Those not arrested were forced into total silence. Events accelerated. There was no turning back. The new government stopped the printing presses. Radio stations broadcast only official state messages. The diversity of the revolution was replaced by a single voice. Thus, the coalition died. Only one power remained.